Good morning. Sorry we're a couple of minutes late. There were some technical issues. Welcome to our fourth Hexham debate of this 17th series. Please do like the debates when they pop up on any of your social media networks. Anyone can join the debate or see the recording by going to the Hexham TV Facebook page or YouTube channel. And when we get to questions, if you want to ask a question, you need to put it in the comments, which should be a box on the top right of your screen. But first of all, I'd like to welcome Alice Wiseman, who's now Director of Public Health at both Gateshead and Newcastle councils. Alice started her career as a teacher in inner city Newcastle before moving into public health, first working as a public health consultant in the NHS and then in local government before becoming a Director of Public Health in 2016. So I think that's all I need to say. So I'm going to pass over to Alice.
Thank you very much. And it's a real privilege to be here this morning and have the opportunity to talk to you. When I was reflecting on the type of presentation that I wanted to provide this morning, I was thinking about the things that really impact health and well-being. And as you will all know, I'm sure, the homes we live in, the jobs we have, the friends we have, and the communities and spaces that we get to live in are those key real drivers for health and well-being. And often we spend a lot of time worried about, our NHS services, and I'm sure lots of us at the moment are, struggling to get into services, whether that be into secondary care or primary care. But I guess when I thought about it, I thought these are all things that we all know about. And so I wanted to take a slightly different tack. And what I've been thinking more and more about is the environments that we live in and the way that those environments are shaped and the control that we have as individuals to shape those environments and the impact that has on some of the decisions and choices that we make. So my presentation this morning is going to focus on what we are determining in public health world as the commercial determinants of health. And if I could have the first slide, that would be great. So this was my annual report this year for Gateshead. It has to be said, I've just started in Newcastle 3 weeks ago, so I'm at the end of week 3. And like I say, this is my 7th annual report as Director of Public Health in Gateshead. And just for those of you who don't know, the Director of Public Health is an annual report. It is intended to be completely independent. So it doesn't represent an organisational or political view, but instead sets out my personal professional perspective of the concerns that I consider to be critical to the health of our communities. When I first started as Director of Public Health back in 2016, I did my first annual report on tobacco and the harm caused by tobacco. And in that report, I talked about the devastating impact that tobacco has had on many of, the residents that live across Gateshead and indeed the North East and indeed globally. But I also spoke about the impact that this has had on my life and the fact that I lost my father at the age of only 54 from a smoking-related illness. The impact that has had on my family, my children, my brothers and sisters, and their children. He only ever got to meet one of his grandchildren. He has 7 grandchildren. And my mum, obviously the impact of losing her loved one has been really significant. And when I started looking at the issue of tobacco harm, I recognised that this wasn't about the individual decisions that my father made. It was more about the fact that this was a product that was promoted and sold in a way that was deemed to be accessible. The first smoking survey took place in 1974, and at this point, over half the population were smoking. And I think this is relevant when I start to talk about some of the other drivers that we've got around health and well-being that are commercially driven now. By the time I wrote my first report in 2016, the smoking prevalence for Gateshead was around 18%. So still almost 2 in 10 people, around 30,000 of the population. And, and we know that is different in different communities. So communities that experience other challenges such as, poverty and lower levels of educational attainment were much more likely to have higher levels of smoking. And we know that around 460 people were dying every year in Gateshead as a result of an entirely legal product. And when I look back at this, I think it's really interesting because rightly so, we had a lot of action during the pandemic, to try and minimize deaths from, preventable deaths from those who were being infected by COVID. But actually, it's around the same number of people who die every single year from tobacco. And we don't necessarily have the same kind of broader societal response to this that we saw during COVID. It's important to say we have made more progress. And as I sit here today, the smoking prevalence in Gateshead is down to 14%. So definitely some progress made over the last few years. But what this means in terms of the numbers of people who are dying is it's now killing around 340 people in Gateshead. And whilst this is still far too high, what it shows is the action that we've taken on this product has actually reduced deaths by about 100, just over 100 each year in Gateshead alone. And now tobacco is often viewed as the original commercial determinant of health. And like I say, this is because of the way the tobacco industry operated and focused on profit, but at the expense of people's health and well-being. So in terms of the definition of commercial determinants of health, they are the private sector activities that affect people's health directly or indirectly, and importantly, positively, but also negatively. And whilst there is so much work to do still with tobacco, and hopefully you've seen the work that's been going on in Parliament this week, the work we have done so far has protected people from poverty. But the work we still have left to do, means that we have the opportunity now to really eradicate this completely for future generations. The vast majority of people who smoke start smoking as a child or a young person. The vast majority of people wish they'd never started and wish that they could stop. So there is more work that we need to do to impact on this. But actually, what can we learn about this to protect people from some of those other commercial determinants of health, such as alcohol, ultra-processed food, and gambling? If I could have the next slide, please. So I'll touch briefly on the harm. Tobacco is the single leading preventable cause of mortality, leading to 64,000 deaths in England each year and harming nearly every organ of the body. Up to 2/3 of smokers die prematurely due to their addiction. And as I've already mentioned from my own personal circumstances, the untold suffering and illness that sits alongside it is really immeasurable. Those people who start smoking as young adults lose on average 10 years of life. And what's even more damaging is that they spend more of their shorter life living in ill health. Around 8 million people have died in the UK due to smoking over the last 50 years. And an estimated 2 million more are expected to die in the next 20 years if we don't have this radical change to smoking rates. So the stark fact is that the tobacco industry and all of the profit that has gone with it are responsible for over a quarter of all deaths that occurred in that half a century. Next slide, please. It's also almost on a daily basis, if not a daily basis, that we hear about the pressures in our health and social care system. And certainly we know we can see waiting lists and people unable to get appointments for GPs, people being missed where there are other issues that are needing to be picked up early. So in this context, I think it's really important that we see tobacco and the impact that tobacco has on our already incredibly stretched health and social care systems. In Gateshead, there are over 2,500 hospital admissions each year as a result of tobacco harm, over 95,000 GP appointments, and over 50,000 GP prescriptions for smoking-related conditions. Healthcare costs in Gateshead are around £9 million. So £9 million of resources that could be used to tackle some of these other issues that we've got going on if we didn't have this perfectly legal product available. And for social care, smokers are 2.5 times more likely to require social care support at home and need care on average 10 years earlier than non-smokers. Next slide, please. When I think about it, I find it really hard to imagine how a seemingly innocent plant can, in plain sight, be processed to become one of the most deadly and profitable products ever known. If tobacco products came to the market today, with the knowledge that they would go on to kill 2 in 3 regular users, I do wonder what the reaction would be. But this is what has happened. Over centuries, pursuit of financial profit has trumped the damage caused to people. Mums, dads, sisters, brothers, nanas, granddads, families ripped apart and lives ending far too early. It was in 1962 that the Royal College of Physicians first outlined a comprehensive report setting out the harms caused by smoking. But initially, the problem was not recognised and public awareness was poor, which was not surprising, really, given the misleading activities and marketing of the industry. Significant lobbying, misinformation, and advocacy from the tobacco industry meant that it would be a further 36 years before we implemented this in the UK. I do often reflect on how my public health predecessors must have felt, incredibly helpless, nobody wanting to hear that this product, which was so normalised at the time, was in fact responsible for significant levels of illness and death. And I admit sometimes when I'm sitting in my office or out in my communities, I feel that same sense of helplessness, especially when I'm having conversations around alcohol, ultra-processed food, and gambling. Thankfully for us, instead of accepting it was too hard to tackle, new approaches were developed which addressed the complexity of the environment which had enabled this harm to flourish. Multiple strands of work were implemented in parallel over short, medium, and long term, which has undoubtedly saved hundreds of lives in Gateshead and, of course, across the world. And it's this that I'm going to talk to you about. Next slide, please. So this slide tells our journey with tobacco control, starting with that first report from the Royal College of Physicians in 1962. In 1971, the tobacco industry agreed to include health warnings on cigarettes and adverts. In 1986, smoking adverts were banned in cinemas and some women's magazines, and interestingly on the Tyne and Wear metro system. So the North East leading the way in this particular challenge. It was also in 1986 that selling tobacco became illegal to under 16s. It's almost incredible to think that under 16s could go and buy this product, knowing what we knew about it, even until 1986. In 1992, the first nicotine patch became available on prescription, with the hope that we would be able to support those people who had started smoking and became addicted to smoking as children and young people to be able to quit. And I think this is really important. In 1998, a US court awarded damages against a tobacco firm for a family who had lost a relative to lung cancer. Interestingly, this was only 2 years before I lost my own dad in the same way. Next slide, please. But as our journey continues, because it's not done until this product is eradicated from our communities. And in 2003, tobacco ads were banned from billboards, printed media, direct and online advertising. In 2007, smoke-free public spaces went live and the age of sale increased from 16 to 18. In 2012, point-of-sale displays were banned in large stores and the annual quitting campaign Stoptober was launched. In 2015, point-of-sale bans were extended to small shops and smoking was banned in cars carrying children. During this time, there were also price rises and standardized packaging. And as I've already said, as we sit here today, smoking prevalence for Gateshead is down at 14.1%. And for pregnant women, under 10% for the first time. Next slide, please. The impact of all this legislation has been stunning. And this graph shows you that young people's smoking rates. So this is smoking rates in 11 to 15-year-olds. And it is directly in response to the regulations that were introduced in this country during the century. Action on the adult environment has changed the world in which our children and young people grow up. Next slide, please. I've already mentioned the issue of inequalities, but from the perspective of inequality, tobacco is both a cause and a symptom in that it disproportionately affects those living in more deprived areas, causing and maintaining poverty, and is indeed a solid commodity of organised crime. This map was a map that I shared first in 2016, and it highlights the progress that we've made. Progress is not easily won, and I think without real concerted action, easy to lose, and particularly concerning for those communities who experience multiple deprivation. It is really critical to note that the effects of austerity, the pandemic, and the cost of living crisis in recent years has seen health inequalities widen and progress in reducing the gap in life expectancy between the most affluent and the poorest in society increase. Sir Michael Marmot published a report in 2020 as we went into the start of the pandemic, highlighting that for the very first time in 100 years, life expectancy has stalled across the board for all groups. But what was more concerning is it was increasing. Inequalities in life expectancy was increasing between those who are most affluent and those who are poorest. Tobacco control continues to represent an incredibly powerful tool in improving health in communities, and it is central to any strategy that we have to tackle health inequalities. As I've already said, smoking accounts for approximately half the difference in life expectancy between the lowest and the highest income groups. And I think it's really important that we don't forget this. Next slide, please. So I guess the question is, how have we done this locally? You know, despite our own ambition in Gateshead and indeed in all the local authorities across the North East, we recognised that we couldn't do this as a single authority. And this is the same position we're in when we're thinking about some of those wider commercial drivers now. We knew that action was needed at various levels. We knew that stop smoking services to enable those people who had been lured into this addictive product were given the opportunity to be free from it. But we knew that that wouldn't tackle tobacco alone. For every person who dies from a tobacco-related condition, we knew the industry was working incredibly hard to replace those with younger smokers. And so in 2005, the North East came together to develop a comprehensive and coordinated regional tobacco programme called Fresh, with the sole aim of driving down smoking prevalence. And I think this is something that as a North East we can be incredibly proud of. Ailsa Rutter, who's the director of Fresh and has been the director of Fresh since 2005 and indeed lost her own father to smoking-related conditions, has worked with tenacity, with passion, and with a focus on reducing the harm across the North East. And many of the team that she works with have the same focus. The programme is operationalised through these 8 key strands of tobacco control, and they're linked to local activity across the region. So building infrastructure, skills and capacity, you know, advocacy for evidence-based policy. And indeed, you will have seen, I'm sure, Ailsa speaking on various media over the last week as we come towards this exciting opportunity to have a completely smoke-free future for our children. Reducing exposure to tobacco smoke. You know, the North East really led the way on the smoke-free legislation, which was approved in 2007. You know, we were the area of the country that had the most responses from the consultation in terms of increasing smoke-free spaces. And I have no doubt that the work of local people feeding into their MPs, making sure that the MPs vote for the right things, actually has had a major difference. And we know that those people who were not smokers but yet exposed to secondhand smoke, you know, were also exposed to the harm that was caused. Year-round media, communication and education, and I'm hoping you will have seen some of that media over the last few years, you know, thinking about particularly during COVID, where Dr. Ruth Sherrick, who is one of our respiratory consultants in Gateshead, but also leads the way for the North East North Cumbria integrated care network. And I think it was really important that we were recognising the fact that, you know, people in our poorest communities that were being more affected by COVID were often affected worse if they were smokers. So we knew that there was an opportunity for us to support people, you know, during that period to take the opportunity to quit. And so moving on, supporting smokers to stop and stay stopped. I've talked about the importance of our stop smoking services. And indeed, at the moment, we are looking at refreshing those services because we recognise that whilst they have, you know, reduced smoking prevalence across the board, we know that there are communities that we need to do something different with to be able to support them to stop smoking too. Raising price and reducing the illicit trade. Over the last couple of weeks, our trade and standards teams working with the police in Gateshead have made some really significant seizures of tobacco products, which would have flooded the market. And we know that illicit trade is often the way that our children and young people access tobacco these days. So it's not just about, people think that they're almost the Robin Hood of local communities, providing tobacco products at a cheaper cost. We know that this is driving the harm in our communities. Tobacco and nicotine regulation, I've already spoken a lot about, but really changing the adult world changes the world that our kids grow up in. And then finally, data research and public opinion. The vast majority of people in the Northeast, I think it's around 70% of people, support our smoke-free future work that's going through now, and being able to talk to our local MPs, and ensure that they are, voting in the way that will protect the health and well-being of their communities is really important. But it's really important to know that public opinion is with them. Next slide, please. There are common tactics that are used by the industry, in terms of unhealthy commodities, to target consumers and vulnerable populations. So broadly, these include lobbying and party political donations, which then lead to the obstruction and delay for policy and legislative decisions that would support public health. For example, gambling firms have been a leading source of donations to MPs in recent years. Unhealthy commodity industries contradict and cast doubt on the scientific evidence that reveals the harm caused by their products, and instead promote their own industry-funded research. For example, the tobacco industry promoted alternative causes for lung cancer to distract from the link to smoking. There is product placement, and as you walk around in the rest of the day today, think about this as you go around the shops, in terms of promotion and product placement across all mediums, often again particularly concentrated in great areas of greater deprivation or towards more vulnerable groups. A recent study in Scotland found, for example, that children from more deprived areas were more likely to be exposed to unhealthy food and drink product advertising compared to those living in less deprived areas. There is a strong push by industry to avoid mandatory regulation by self-regulation, but research suggests that this does not lead to any public health benefits. For example, a review of the public health responsibility deal found that pledges to improve health were driven by industry interests and were not drawn from the most effective interventions available. For example, they focused on information giving, individual choice, education, which we all know, sadly, whilst important, to be ineffective. Unhealthy commodity industries also invest in charities, good causes, and training, educational initiatives to distract directly from the harm they caused. Industry-sponsored education and awareness raising in school is also common, but has been shown to be biased towards industry interests. For example, an alcohol program with our 11-year-olds that promotes moderate alcohol consumption, therefore seeking again to normalize it. And finally, the personal responsibility narrative. This is central to their approach. They argue that as individuals, we must take responsibility for what we choose to do, for what we choose to consume, and for how regularly we do that. The industry argue that public health interventions are akin to the nanny state, unduly interfering in personal choice. However, they do this while failing to acknowledge the significant role that they have in shaping our environments and ultimately influencing our choices through their own activities. Would any business seriously spend millions on marketing if it didn't change the choices that we make? Next slide, please. So what can we do? What can we learn from the work on tobacco? First, we need to recognise and accept that there is a problem, accepting the link between alcohol, cancer, and cardiovascular disease, for example, and then we need to resource it accordingly. Then we need to have the multi-layered strategy, which most importantly has a long-term focus. We certainly can't do this overnight. We need to collaborate to do this across and agree across partners and also with our communities, how we will jointly own and monitor this, and have one key message which is communicated by everyone alongside visible and really enthusiastic leadership. Next slide, please. Communication is incredibly important to this, and real engagement with communities. It's only when we take the community with us that we will see this progress and change. Local champions are therefore critical, and over the years, tobacco control efforts and our local champions have included doctors, elected members, residents, and those who've been affected. It is much more powerful to hear real stories from real people. And as you saw earlier, a focus on changing the adult world is critical to change the environment that our kids will grow up in. And finally, and I take this from my public health predecessors in 1962 and onwards, tenacity. Culture change is complex and it'll take time and proper engagement with people. People don't change by being told. It needs to be a two-way process. Next slide, please. I don't know if we can play this slide or not, but I can speak the story if we can't. I'll speak to the story. So this story is from a lady called Karen that we worked with around alcohol. And she talked as part of our Balance campaign, which is our regional office for alcohol, similar to Fresh, very bravely about her own experience of this harm from alcohol and how the industry influenced her and affected her. Karen is 55. She's a Newcastle mum of 4. She experienced alcohol harm firsthand when she was growing up around hostile and dangerous environments. She was a victim of child abuse and domestic violence and sought solace in alcohol, drugs, and self-harm. Karen recalls living in a deprived area and feeling isolated and alone and believing that alcohol was the solution. Just before Christmas, Karen told us, I already feel bombarded by the adverts of alcohol that come into my home and give out the message that alcohol is pleasurable, that it brings families together for the Christmas festivities. You can't move around a supermarket for piles and piles of alcohol. But alcohol advertising is insidious. It comes on the TV and it looks really glamorous with the pink drinks. But that is a drug that's addictive. There are millions of people trying to battle alcohol, and yet we're watching it on TV every night. Every night there are adverts, and as soon as you see one advert, you think about it. For someone who's having a bad day or a bad moment that could trigger a relapse. She added, my reality and thousands of others is the exact opposite. If you've experienced alcohol problems, Christmas in the real world, away from the alluring adverts of alcohol, can be one drink-fueled isolation, domestic violence, child neglect, A&E being overrun by drunken people. People who are alcohol dependent live lives constantly like this. The adverts never show that struggle, and I feel they shouldn't be allowed to come into my home when I never gave them permission. My home is my haven, and I'm in recovery. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting slide, and if we look at the issue of food, it is really obvious. It is obviously different from tobacco, and the food industry does have differences from tobacco industry in important ways, but there are also incredible similarities in the responses to the concern that their products cause. These are the 10 corporations who largely control what we eat, how it's produced, what we can afford, what is available, and how it's marketed. Obesity is now a global pandemic, and we can't afford to repeat the mistakes that we've had of tobacco. The problem of overweight and obesity provides a useful example of how these factors overlap. Production and marketing of high fat, high salt, high sugar convenience foods, and promotions such as buy one, get one free in supermarkets and takeaways. 95% of buy one, get one free is consumed as extra calories and therefore unnecessary costs, rather than saving money and helping people reduce their food costs. Next slide, please. Gambling. For more than 20 years, the UK government policy has portrayed gambling firstly as enjoyable, secondly as an expression of adult freedom, and lastly as harmful only to a minority. The narrative has been dominated by individualized and often psychological understandings that serve to maintain the status quo and hide broader societal perspectives, such as the harmful effects of gambling products and gambling environments. Governments across the world have primarily focused on individualized behavioral addiction frameworks. And whilst this is not wrong by itself, it's not sufficient. Gambling harm is complex and difficult to pin down. There are diverse impacts on individuals and communities' health and well-being, from financial and material loss to relationship breakdown, abusive relationships, neglect of others, debt, poverty, crime, and sadly, suicide. A recent study found that gambling firms make at least 70% of their money from the 5% of accounts with the biggest losses. Gamblers from the poorest areas were more likely to lose money in online casinos with a high-risk, high-intensity play, more likely to have lost their money using virtual slot machines, which is a product that we know has a high rate of addiction. Next slide, please. So I always make recommendations in relation to my annual report for our full council to consider. And these are my recommendations. Obviously, the work around tobacco needs to continue with supporting the proposed age of sale legislation, advocating for the polluter pays. Why should the industry take all of this money that is creating harm and costing us as citizens in terms of the impact? And then support and enforce vape regulation so that it's available for those people who need to quit, but not available and promoted to children. Next slide, please. We're redesigning our current offer to make sure that we are targeting those people who are finding it hardest to quit. And we need to normalise a quitting environment where smokers make regular quit attempts. It's perfectly okay to fail multiple times before succeeding. But to do that, smokers need to be offered an opportunity to quit at every turn. Prevention needs to be embedded in all of our job roles across the public sector. And finally, we have made so much progress with tobacco, but it's not done. And we must keep our foot on the pedal. I firmly believe we now have a large opportunity to eradicate tobacco for the next generation, our children's children. Next slide, please. For alcohol, we're starting a bit further back. Firstly, we need to protect health policy, health services, and education and awareness from industry influence. They have shown that they are too conflicted, in many ways understandably, as they must maintain profit and work to address harm. Second, we need to protect children from alcohol marketing. It's not okay that children is so normalised that our primary school kids can name alcohol brands in the way that they can name other products. And thirdly, we need to challenge that narrative of personal responsibility and start to think about how we can create environments that promote and protect health. People do not make decisions in vacuums, and there's no way that the industry would spend money on marketing if it didn't change our behaviour. Next slide, please. Learning from food advertising policies in other local authority areas, advertising products high in fat, sugar and salt should be restricted on our council-owned sites. And we also need to harness the power of local community. We need people to understand how commercial factors are influencing their health. We've seen some great work over recent years where the communities have been able to come together to tackle the problem for themselves. And my final slide is touching on gambling. First, we need to accept that this is a problem causing harm and acknowledge that it is a public health issue. Around 12% of people are harmed now by gambling. Following that, we must advocate for a comprehensive public health approach, learning again from tobacco and recognising the industry as a key vector of harm. And finally, this needs to include the development of policies and strategies based on the precautionary principles that prioritise health and well-being, protect individuals and their communities and their families from being harmed by the gambling industry, its products and its practices. So I hope you've enjoyed that this morning. I appreciate it's probably different to what you were expecting, but I just think it's important that people understand how our world is shaped by those who are seeking to increase profit when actually it is causing and resulting in harm in our communities. Thank you.
Sorry, just waiting to be unmuted there. Thank you, Alice. That was fascinating. I wasn't quite sure what to expect from your presentation anyway, so that's fine that you decided what was going to be most impactful. And that was, yeah, I'm still kind of reeling a little bit. And we haven't got any questions yet, so I'm going to just remind people to use the comments box to put questions in. While I think of it, just at the end there, you said about 12% of people being harmed by gambling. Did you mean of the people that gamble?
No, of the population.
Right, okay.
It's the gambling industry like us to think that it's less than 1% of people that are affected by gambling harm, but actually it's significantly higher, and it is a population issue. And I think in public health, we're a little bit late to the party, if you like. There's been lots of really good charities that have been set up, you know, trying to tackle alcohol, gambling harm, you know, and actually recognizing that this is a problem, you know, because I was reading a case study in Gateshead of an individual person the other day who'd accessed support from Citizens Advice, and what it was suggesting was that he wasn't managing to make his money stretch, and he was living in, you know, pretty desperate situation. But when they looked at it, he was spending relatively, for lots of people, small amount of money on, you know, scratch cards, you know, in the hope that he could prop up his relatively low income, but that was leaving him without the resources to buy food and heat his home. And it is that bit around it offers a glimmer of hope for people, but then draws the resources, and ultimately it is designed to take money off people. And
right, exactly.
Yeah.
So what do you know, what percentage of the population takes part in gambling, or is that hard to tell because someone might just put one bet on the Grand National and then not do any other gambling?
Yeah, and it is that's the challenge with it. It's that variation, isn't it? There are certain products that are really harmful, so the online products, the promotion, so my son, who's 19, got a text message the other day saying he could have £10 of a free spin on some app, and sort of, again, drawing people in as quickly as they can. So there are certain products that are more harmful than others, but they're not necessarily regulated in the way that we need them to be. And we know that there are certain products, sort of the slot machines, the online slot machines, that are more likely to create that addiction because they give you that small win and then draw you in and create that level of harm. But like I say, there's some academics that have been doing some amazing work on this over the last few years. And, there's an academic particularly based in Australia who's kind of leading the charge nationally on how we can, make sure that this is an issue that we consider from a public health perspective. There's a family in Sheffield lost their son to gambling harm. He was in his early 20s. He was called Jack Ritchie, and for the very first time, the coroner put on his death certificate that it was in response to gambling that had taken his life. And it's that type of shift. And his parents have gone on to set up their own charity, to try and make sure that people are aware of this harm that's caused. But it is work that we need to do more on.
So you mentioned when you were talking about tobacco, about education not having a huge impact, but does it, like, if people are completely unaware of the harm that something might cause, does it still help to do that, especially with young people? I'm thinking about the gambling and the alcohol.
So I think people have a right to know. So I think education is important from that perspective, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't change behaviours. So the industry wants us to spend all of our time educating and telling people it's about their individual choices. And it is about, yes, people have the right to know, but by providing an education program, you're never going to tackle harm on its own. So it's not that it's not there. It just needs to not be the only sole focus.
And does regulation work, or are they always ahead of us, the commercial organisations? They just find a way around by the time you've got the regulation and they've thought of another thing to do?
Yeah, and there is a bit of that, so that, we have to work really carefully and smartly. But you'll see from that graph I showed earlier on around the regulation that's taken place since 2000 and the impact that that's had on 11 to 15-year-olds smoking, so 19% down to 5%. So it does work, but there's also, I think the one thing that's important is not to think of one silver bullet. So people often say, oh, if you do that, and then, it needs to be a range of measures. So if we look at alcohol, they've just agreed in the last couple of weeks, it might even be last week, to increase their minimum unit price in Scotland up to 65 pence. That was a really fantastic success, but that programme has, in Scotland, has reduced harm. And, but the alcohol industry twisted it and said it wasn't reducing addiction, but it was always aimed as a population measure. So it's reduced average consumption in households. But obviously those people who were already addicted, that it was never designed to do that, but it'll hopefully prevent people from becoming addicted in the future.
Yeah, and like with all of these things, we need a multiple approach, don't we? Same with environmental issues and the other subjects we've had. I'm just a question now up from Wendy Breach. I'll just read it out. You've mentioned the ills of smoking, alcohol, gambling, and ultra-processed food, but not the problems associated with I'm not going to be able to say that. I'm going to say obesity environment. So I was thinking about that as well. So that we drive everywhere and don't exercise. So it's not just the food. And what benefits the NHS if we became healthier by choosing to walk or cycle instead of driving?
It's a really, really good question. And so there was a report that was done back in, I think, 2008 called the Foresight Report. And they had this spaghetti diagram of all the things that we need to do to tackle obesity. Because like with tobacco, it's not one thing. The one thing I would say is that exercise is really important, but actually what we have seen is that it is more about the food that we consume and more about the food that and the way it's produced and the way it's promoted. Dr. Chris Van Tulleken has done some amazing YouTube videos if anybody wants to Google him about ultra processed food. I've just finished reading his book Ultra Processed People, and they did some research where they looked at, you know, kind of people who were hunter gatherers in Africa versus people who were desk based work, and what they said was your body adjusts to the amount of exercise that you take.
Right.
So you still end up using a similar number of calories because your body has that adjustment. The problem being is if you're desk based, you're more likely to burn calories through stress and anxiety, which is not good for you. So physical activity has a whole range of benefits there, and I absolutely think that that's the space we should be getting into in terms of, and not just sport, because I think that people think, you know, as Wendy said in her question there, it is about how do we build physical activity into our daily lives. So since I started my new role in Newcastle, I've been getting, you know, the metro and moving between the two councils on the metro, and I've left the car at home, you know, but actually what we want is more investment into that public transport system so that we can make it as easy as possible. And certainly with the new combined authority for the 7 local authorities in the north of the region, you know, transport's a massive thing that they're going to be working on, and I'm really hopeful that that will start to shift the way that people move around as well.
Yeah, if it makes it easier. And I must admit, for me, if I'm doing something else like exercising, then I'm less likely to be drinking alcohol or eating processed food. So there's kind of an element as well, isn't there? Right, moving to Jim Robertson's got a question. Are there industries in the northeast which adversely impact on environment and health? I'm not sure if he's talking about specific, whether we've got the tobacco companies. And I know Tom Bowler is based in, I just found out Tom Bowler's headquarters, that's one of the gambling firms, is in Sunderland.
Oh, right. Okay. So there you go. Yes, we have. I'm sure we have, you know, I mean, interestingly, in terms of the environment, because that is the other thing, is that all of these industries do impact on our environment and on climate issues as well, you know. So another book that I would recommend reading is a book called Dark PR by a guy called Grant Ennis, and he talks about the car industry, of the food industry, and the impact that they have in terms of our environment. So, you know, cutting down massive you know, parts of the environment in South America so that we can produce the products, you know, the soy and the wheat that actually fuels our ultra processed food, but then has that wider impact, but also on our car usage. And, you know, I appreciate we are all a bit stuck to our cars, and you know, as a community, I'm sure there are people on the call who aren't, but you know, as communities we are, and actually we know the harm that's caused by you know, by driving, but also by the production of those cars. And again, in this book Dark PR, he talks about the fact that our environment determines whether we are able to move around by foot or by bike. And actually we've almost created this urban sprawl, you know, so we want to live in places where there's lots of space, but that then drives car usage behavior. And so actually we need to start thinking about the way our planners are involved with this, in terms of those planning those sort of 15-minute neighborhoods where people can actually walk around and, you know, get to where they need to get to without using their car. And, you know, certainly one of the things that Adult Social Care was looking at in Gateshead, which I thought was really interesting, was how do we recruit local people to provide care for other local people in their communities, so the carers can move around on foot, but also so they're not driving from one part of Gateshead to another to provide care for an individual person. But so it needs to be part of all of our thinking, you know, in everything that we do. But climate and health is massively linked.
Yeah, the personal responsibility again. You know, people say we're choosing to use our cars, but there's not as much choice as people make there.
Well, and his argument, Grant Ennis in this book, is that we often, if we put things down to individuals to do, you know, so whether that is about, you know, recycling, or actually, you know, we should put this responsibility back on the industries that are profiting from, you know, creation of all these plastic bottles that we're then not necessarily using properly. And governments do subsidize those as well. So, you know, there are subsidies that go in from a government perspective, which makes, you know, cars cheaper and more available. It makes, you know, sort of ultra processed food more affordable. So there actually is a question mark about how that resource is done nationally.
Yeah, so at least we could do is not support
not subsidise ourselves. Yeah, absolutely.
And this is a question about, are there good examples from around the world that you can highlight as good practice? So you've talked about some of your recommendations. Are there places where they do those things?
Yeah, so I mean, even if you look closer to home than, you know, sort of across the world, if you look at the work that Wales and Ireland and Scotland are all doing to tackle the issue of alcohol harm, you know, it is, you know, they've introducing minimum unit price, ensuring that there aren't those sort of promotions that mean that actually, you know, the shops kind of lose out, but actually they gain from getting you to buy those products in the first place. And actually, you did ask about regulation earlier on and about industry getting round regulation.
Yeah.
So over the last couple of years, they've been working to say, actually, let us provide zero alcohol products. So they've got these zero alcohol products, and I have no problem with people drinking zero alcohol products. But in Ireland, where they've banned or limited marketing of alcohol products, they're replacing the brand recognition with zero and no alcohol products. So you've still got a Heineken bottle, for example, and from the outside of it, it looks exactly the same as the Heineken bottle with alcohol. So they're getting round that regulation to reduce alcohol advertising by promoting their no and low products. But really, it's just brand recognition.
Exactly. That's problematic.
I mean, we did the idea for Fresh was taken from California. There was loads of great work that was going on in California around tobacco harm. And so, you know, we do definitely reach out. And there was a global alcohol conference that took place in South Africa in October, you know, where countries from around the world came together to talk about, you know, what they were doing to tackle alcohol as an issue. And I think what's incredibly sad is because our market has been saturated across Western countries. It was the way that the alcohol industry are now moving into some of our third world countries, you know, where they weren't drinking alcohol, but introducing it in a way that is meaning that it's becoming a problem in those areas. And similarly, you can see the same sort of thing with ultra processed food as well.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I had a question and then it's just fallen out of my head. Oh, I know what it was. It was about the smoking, the thing that's just come in, the legislation, well, that they've been voted, agreed on. I didn't really see that coming. Was that, how long has it taken to get government to propose the banning all cigarette smoking for children?
So really, since 1962 is the real story to it, you know, and that it has to be done incrementally. We have to take the public with us. It didn't need to take as long. And no. I think if we protected health policy from industry influence earlier, it would have happened faster. And that's what I'm suggesting we need to do for alcohol and food and gambling, is that the industry don't have a place around the table when we're shaping health policy. So, I mean, we were pleased and pleasantly surprised when it was announced. So sometimes these things happen and they do come, you know, you're working on it day in, day out, you know, sort of particularly Ailsa, who I've mentioned, lobbying for this for many years, ASH, you know, Action on Smoking and Health, lobbying for it. And then all of a sudden you get this moment of progress. But there was a review that was done a couple of years ago now by, and the Khan report, and what it was looking at was actually what we needed to do around tobacco, and lots of the things that have come through this legislation now were recommended in that report, which was a kind of cross-party support report, so not again politically driven, which I think is the most important thing with this work.
Agree. But what I did find was, I didn't listen to a lot of the news about it, but I didn't think it was stressed enough that this was about stopping people from starting smoking. And then, you know, because if you're already smoking, if somebody's saying, right, you're never going to be able to buy a cigarette again, like, that's really scary. And I don't think there's enough said about this was making sure people didn't get, you know, they're not going to get addicted in the first place, so they're not going to need that. And it was only later on that I heard someone reassuring, I think it was somebody standing up in the Parliament saying that it's not going to stop people who are already smoking.
And it's also not going to criminalise individuals. It's going to criminalise the sale of them to young people, but not the individuals themselves, you know. So, and I think that's an important distinction as well. But you know, people talk about that kind of freedom to choose, but the point is that people who become addicted to cigarettes early don't have they have their freedom taken away from them.
Exactly.
You know, and actually, but that's again a framing and a narrative that's enjoyed by industry, because it makes people think, well, I don't want to be, you know, stopped. But actually, if you had complete control, and where we saw that drop in smoking in young people, it was directly in response to changing that adult world. So if we want to protect our future generations, that's what we need to do.
And do you think, I'm thinking, if this goes through okay, will it make it easier, do you think, to regulate? I mean, I don't think we'll be able to ban alcohol, but, you know, just to show that we can do things for future generations.
So so interestingly, there's if you Google the 1962 Royal College of Physicians report, there's a really interesting BBC clip that's shown with it. It's just a couple of minutes. And at that point, people were saying, oh, I don't want them to take my cigarettes away from me. I enjoy smoking. And actually, I think we are. So it reminds me of the conversations I have around alcohol.
Okay.
I don't think it's quite as clear the end point with alcohol as well, you know, whereas tobacco is so harmful. If it was brought to the market today, we wouldn't, you know, sort of. But what we know is that people don't understand, for example, that 1 in 10 breast cancers are caused by alcohol consumption.
Yeah.
You know, and actually, you know, they cause 7 types of cancer. Some of the cancers it causes are, you know, the hardest to treat. So people are losing their lives, not just through addiction, but just through general alcohol consumption. So for me, there's a whole process we need to go through around denormalization of it. You know, where 50% of people in Gateshead drink above the chief medical officer's recommended guidelines. But actually, you know, that was a similar number of people who were smoking in you know, sort of in the mid 70s. So we just need to reduce that harm and work on that. But we do need to take people with us. I understand that, which is why I'm trying to focus this sort of talk with people, so that people actually understand how they're influenced by industry.
Absolutely, yeah. And Peter's put up a question there more about public health in general. What's been the impact?
Yeah. So the public health grant, since we were moved in from the NHS into local government, has been cut by about 25%. But that's a national cut. So our grant, and you know, hasn't, you know, sort of increased in line with inflation. You know, we are stuck with some of the challenges we've got is that it's not increasing. And then we have things like, and rightly so, the rise in salaries, you know, within places, and on our budgets haven't gone up to the same extent. So when you see that, then it starts to put pressure on local services. Right. But if I'm honest with you, I'm not just concerned about the cuts to the public health funding, because they are for very specific things, but a council is largely a public health organisation. If you think about the things that it does, you know, around, you know, employment, you know, mitigations for poverty, you know, working into and with communities, planning, transport, you know, all of those things are the things that impact and influence our health and well-being. So, you know, what I'm concerned about at the moment is that the cuts to local government are meaning that we are increasingly responding to people when they're in crisis, rather than being able to get in early and prevent things from escalating in the first place. And it's not a sensible, you know, sort of way of funding those services. But, you know, if I look to Gateshead, it's £1,000 less per head of population that Gateshead has since 2015 to now. You know, so some really tricky decisions are needing to be made, have been made, and will need to be made over the next couple of years if that doesn't significantly change. You know, I am concerned about that, and I am concerned about that, and I think that this is largely why we've seen the life expectancy stalling and inequalities growing again, as set out by Michael Marmot.
Yeah. And what about, is it any easier for you to do your job from local authority rather than being in the NHS, as you've worked in both of those, or does it not really make a huge difference?
No, it really does. And I think it's great being in local authorities. I mean, I think that if you think about where public health started, it was around, you know, kind of like tackling the issue of cholera and the you know, the slum housing clearances and, you know, all of those things. If you're thinking about health at a population level, it sits much better with local authorities, because that's the view that they have. We do still work with the NHS, and I have a statutory duty to provide advice to the NHS on the sorts of things they do. We've got a great close working relationship with the NHS. But again, they are in the same position as local authorities, dealing with so much crisis that they're not able to get the resources that they would like to get into the prevention work. You know, and I went round 4 places in Newcastle yesterday I took Chris Whitty round because he wanted to see what was going on in terms of the health in Newcastle. And actually the work that's going on in local communities with local people is absolutely health creation, but actually recognizing that often we're not able to provide the funding that we'd like to provide. So we started at a place called Rococo in the centre of Newcastle that provides support for people who've got lived experience of mental illness. And there were some amazing people who were, you know, working, you know, kind of volunteering and providing, you know, support back to people who are at different stages of their recovery journey. We then went to Fenham Residents Association, which was started in the 1980s by a group of people on that estate who wanted to make a difference in their own community. And they talked about things like provision of homework clubs to the kids who don't necessarily have space in their home to study. And we know that education's critical for health and well-being. I then went to Biker Primary. What an amazing school, you know, with such diversity, but such compassion for their kids. And they talked about the fact that actually the pandemic has changed the way they've needed to teach, because many of their younger children didn't get those foundation stages of learning sitting in a classroom. So we watched a geography lesson where they were out on the yard, you know, kind of doing their coordinates, you know, but in a really sort of active and physical way. And then we finished at Biker Sands, the family support, which was, and all of it was around how people are coming together in partnership to tackle things within communities. And I think that that's a really exciting, you know, way of looking at things. But actually, that's where I would like to invest more of our resources. But we're often left dealing with crisis rather than being able to really get in. And actually, communities know what they need to do to create health and well-being. They can do it themselves as long as they're given the resources and enabled to do it. So I'm hoping over the next few years that we'll see some shifts in that direction as well.
Thank you so much, Alice. And I think you've really met our kind of Hexham Debates aim, which is to give people the information they need to be able to make you know, informed decisions and to understand where things, you know, where problems are coming from and not just go straight for the kind of end result. So you've really helped.
Great. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
So our next debate, online debate, is 11 a.m. on Saturday, the 11th of May. And that will be Dr. Julia Cooper is going to be talking on the topic of the future of farming, imagining an agroecological future. So hopefully you'll be able to join us then. And remember to tell all your friends they can watch the recording of this anytime on Hexham TV. And yes, and anyone can come along to the next one just by accessing through Hexham TV and the Facebook page. Thank you very much. See you next time.